Good evening and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam, Marketing Specialist, and I'll be your moderator. Tonight's webinar will be a roundtable discussion on the benefits of proper transition planning. Throughout the evening, we'll hear from the Henry Schein Professional Practice Transitions team, with the roundtable moderated by HSPPT Senior Director, Dr. Tom Snyder. Before we get started, we've got a few reminders. At any point during the webinar, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A section of your control panel and we'll email you back within 2 business days with an answer. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. And this webinar is sponsored by Henry Schein Dental Business Institute as well as Henry Schein Professional Practice Transitions. With that, I will throw it over to you, Tom.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining our panel discussion this evening. Our panelists are 3 Henry Schein Professional Practice Transition consultants who are going to discuss a broad range of topics with you tonight. First, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of transition planning, talk about why you should have your practice valued now, steps to take to enhance your practice's value, and steps you should take if you're thinking about selling your practice in the near future. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce my colleague and co-hosts this evening, Miss Eileen Anderson. Eileen?
Hi, everybody. I'm Eileen Anderson. I am a transition sales consultant like the members of our panel, but I'm also a member of our valuation team. I'm a CPA, a certified valuation analyst, and I use that expertise to value dental practices across the country. Many of you may have seen my name if you've had a Henry Schein valuation. It's exciting to be here tonight. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you much, Lee. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists for this evening. I'll start with Jessica.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Burbon, and I represent Oregon and Washington. And I've got about 15 years of experience in the real estate industry, financial lending, and dental. So I have a unique hybrid background to help doctors with all their transition needs.
Thank you. Sara?
Hi, everyone. I am Sara Marterella, and I cover the Michigan market. So prior to joining Henry Schein in 2017, I worked for a national financial planning and consulting company where I got a lot of experience in dental practice management and what makes a successful transition. I also have my real estate license, and I'm happy to serve the Michigan dentists that are looking to transition.
And finally, Greg.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. So my name is Greg Whitmer. I cover and handle practice transitions for us in New England. So I live and reside in Boston, but I cover all of New England, which means Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. So I've been in the dental industry for 11 plus years now. A lot of that was spent on the lending side. I worked with one of the large banks doing lending to dental practices, and I came over to Henry Schein to work in the transition consultant role a couple of years ago, and been off and running ever since.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, before we get started, I just want to review a couple of points with you regarding our profession. Some of you may have heard some of our prior webinars that Eileen and I have been presenting since COVID began, and admittedly, back in February, March of 2020, things didn't look so good. And I'm happy to report that with what I'm going to share with you tonight, we are on a major league rebound, as you probably are aware, and it's all good news. The ADA started an interesting panel survey back in March of 2020, where they initially invited 70,000 practitioners, all age groups, solo group, DSO, specialists, and had a series of questions to kind of track our profession's progress. And this panel was really presenting results every 2 weeks. So I have some data from the most recent panel, which ended May 17th. So we looked at practitioners, whether they be solo or small groups, and we found that 61% of them are now open for business and business as usual. About 39% are open and have a slightly lower patient volume, but not a radically lower, but still lower than prior years. The DSOs fared a little bit better. About 79% of them are open now, business as usual, with about 21% open with a little bit lower patient volume. We also, for the specialist side, we found that endodontists were the least impacted by the pandemic. And that kind of makes sense because many of them never really closed. They were primary caregivers and they were taking over a lot of the emergencies for the GPs who were closed. And so 75% of the endodontists reported that they're open for business and business as usual. The one specialty that lagged behind the other groups were prosthodontics, and about 53% of them reported that they were open with business as usual. Some interesting things came out about staffing, which I'm sure some of you are experiencing, that 67% of dentists said that they are having a challenging time hiring hygienists and dental assistants. And we know from our reps across the country that a number of our clients had retirements particularly from hygienists who didn't want to go back. We had issues where hygienists who were working part-time had childcare and with home learning, as they really had to stay at home and couldn't work. So that's still a challenge. Also, some financial actions that dentists have taken since the reopening. 20% of dentists have raised fees, and a lot of that's to offset the PPE costs. 13% of dentists are still looking for financial assistance with loans and others. And about 2% dentists have retired or sold their practice. So that kind of gives you just like a little overview of where the profession is. But the bottom line is that we're back in business and things are going very well. So kind of let's get started. Greg, I'm going to ask you the first question. Why do your doctors have their practices valued?
Oh man. So yeah, I mean, of course, there's a lot of different reasons. I would think, the one that probably comes to mind right away for most of my clients is to sell the practice. So to get into a transition situation, looking for a buyer to sell the practice and move into the next phase of my client's career. So I would say that one of the main reasons, of course, that they're looking for a practice valuation is for that transition planning, and as they start to prepare to sell the practice. For the most obvious reason, of course, is to get kind of a target price as we take the practice to the open market. But there's also there's some fringe benefits that come with it that I talk to with my clients when we're doing a practice valuation, which is pretty much everything that I'm collecting from financials and details on the practice, we're going to need when we start approaching buyers as we're looking to sell the practice. So we're kind of getting a jump start on that. And it also allows myself and the seller, my client, to kind of dive into the practice to see, what it looks like as we really dig into some of those numbers, which again, a buyer is going to do in consultation with their CPA, and then eventually the bank that is going to be lending the money to the buyer. So I think the most obvious would certainly be in a sales situation. So we start to dig into the practice and get very valuable key information as you have a seller that is ready to look at taking the practice to the open market in a sales situation.
Thanks. Sara, how about you?
Well, with a consulting background, I really enjoy doctors who reach out to me that say, hey, I am getting ready to plan for the future, and I want to think about this down the road. So anybody that knows me knows that I am a super planner. I planned how to buy my first home, my second home, put my kids through college. I'm 47, I'm planning for my retirement, and because it's something I've thought about since I turned about 40. So I think that planning is an important component to making sure that you are in the driver's seat for success. And I don't know about you, but I want to work because I love what I do. I don't want to work because I have to. So I would say that a lot of my doctors that come to me are looking for that planning, and they know my background in the Michigan market, and they're saying, hey, set me up for success, and I want to do this a couple of years in advance so that when it's time, I can call you and we can move forward.
Great, thanks. How about you, Jess?
I would say when I get a call for evaluation, I get really excited because I can not only look at their clinical reports, their production, I can look at their financials, and I can look for things that we can improve on. So the point of doing evaluation 3 to 5 to 10 years before a transition event is so that, like Greg said, we're targeting a sales price. Well, if the doctor is not currently satisfied with where they're at, we can look at it through a different lens and figure out ways to help them boost their top line. And it's just, our valuation reports are second to none in the market. They are so comprehensive, so detailed, and they really hold their weight. So I hold a lot of value with our practice valuations.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask each of you a pretty straightforward question. I'm going to start out with you, Sara. Do you consider yourself a broker or a consultant?
What a great question, Tom. Thank you so much. To me, brokers are transactional. It's about grabbing the listing and calling a couple of buyers and seeing if anybody has some interest, versus a transition sales consultant is relational. I got into this because I care about the legacy that our doctors have. And so I would say, hands down, I am a consultant.
Greg, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sara said it, really well. So I would echo, most of what she said. I would say certainly a consultant. I like the comment that, brokers are transactional, but what we do and how involved we are in when our clients see what goes into actually selling your practice, there's a lot of consulting along the way. There's a lot of moving parts when you're talking about selling a business. And so having a partner to help through that's done it before and help to answer questions. So I think without question, I would say I feel more like a consultant, and then on some days, maybe a little bit of a psychologist as well.
That's for sure.
I definitely see myself through a consultant lens. Throughout my career, my title has been real estate broker or principal broker, but I'm a transition sales consultant. And it's all about building the relationships with these doctors. And it's a very emotional process selling a practice. And we have to hold their hands. It's baby steps. And I love getting to the end of the transition. And a lot of times these guys become your friends. And it's just a really unique job that we have. And so I definitely see myself as a consultant.
Thanks. Eileen, I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit.
Sounds great. Let's walk through the transition process, and why don't you identify what you do differently? Sara, can you talk about our evaluation and how you use it in the transition process?
So the first step is I have a transition planning call with the doctor, and we talk about the practice. And from there, the client usually engages in a valuation. So we do an on-site meeting. And with the on-site meeting, we're gathering practice data, financials, also looking at the facility. We also spend a little bit of time talking about the real estate, if the real estate is part of the transition, because it's an important component to come up with the rent and the cash flow. So I use the whole entire process, and including our valuation, that uses 3 different methodologies to come up with the value to create that success for our client.
Sounds great. Thank you. Jess, can you touch on the sales tools that were developed using the valuation data?
Absolutely, Eileen. Okay, so my 3 favorite pieces that we utilize are the cash flow. And oftentimes, if a practice owner owns the real estate, they probably pay themselves, but we make a lot of adjustments within the cash flow so that it's a buyer can come in and see what it's going to look like once they acquire the practice. We also have a COVID activity worksheet. So what we've done is we've taken the actual days worked versus the normal days worked from 2019. And then that data is sliced in a number of different ways to normalize the 2020. And then the last thing that we have is the practice profile. So we put a lot of the information that the doctors filled out in our questionnaire. And also, we have photos of the practice, and we have key information the buyer needs to make a decision if they want to proceed forward with an LOI. So it really streamlines the process, and there's less disruption, because when you're selling your practice, oftentimes I think of myself as kind of an the radar detective, because a lot of the times the doctor doesn't want the staff to know. So we get a lot of that information out to the prospective buyers on the front end.
Excellent. Thank you. Greg, can you talk about how you find buyers and how you work with them?
Yeah, sure. So, buyers, obviously I can speak specifically here in my market in New England, but no shortage of buyers on the market. The main way that I typically have buyers reach out to me when a practice is for sale is they found the listing on our website. That's probably the biggest spot that my buyers come from. We also send out a newsletter. The state dental societies will usually run our listing ads as well. And then, of course, the other benefit of working with Henry Schein is we have a lot of reps in the field that are in practices every day that may be aware of an owning doctor that's looking to buy a second or a third practice, or an associate that has mentioned they're looking to own their own thing. So all of those ways is typically how the buyer will reach out to me and inquire about a practice that's for sale. And from there, I'm always having, of course, the first conversation with that buyer. The first thing I'm doing is getting a non-disclosure agreement or a confidentiality agreement signed by the buyer to make sure they understand the confidential nature of the sale and everything that we'll be talking about. Once that's signed and on file, I will give them a little bit more details on the practice, where it's located, give them some of the information so we can see if it's still something that is maybe a fit for that particular buyer. And if so, I'm vetting that buyer, to the point of understanding the background of the buyer, their production capabilities, what they're looking for in a practice, because obviously the main part of my job is to make sure I'm finding a fit for my seller. So as we're having those conversations, I'm informing my client or the seller about this potential buyer. I may grab a resume or a CV from the buyer, usually do, and share that with the seller. And then setting up, once I've had a chance to vet that buyer, talk with them a little bit about their financial situation. As I mentioned kind of off the top, I have a lending background, so I know what the banks are typically looking for in a buyer in terms of being able to provide them a loan to purchase a practice. So I want to get a little bit of a background on that, get them introduced to a couple of banks so they're already starting that process. And then once we're at that point, if it's still an interest level, then I'm going to be taking that buyer through the practice, of course, so they can physically see it. Hopefully we have a chance to meet with the seller even at that point. And then, of course, at that time, if it's still feeling like a fit, then the conversations and the discussions get a little bit more serious. But, like I said, no shortage of buyers, at least here in New England. So it's just a matter of finding the right fit. And that's, what my job is. And there's a lot on my plate to do that as I'm talking to potential buyers. But, that's kind of the fun part of the job is trying to find that match for your seller when a buyer comes through.
Great. Thank you so much. So Jessica, can you tell us what are the next steps?
Absolutely. So once I have a buyer who's interested in the practice, we need to set up a showing. And I really like to have the selling doctor there. This is their second home. They know all the nuances, all the gizmos, everything. And oftentimes they want to show off their practice. And it's a great time for the buyer and seller to meet. Sometimes these people do not gel. And you will know right away, okay, this is probably not going to be a match. And that's okay. This is their business, and we want to find the right person who's going to continue on their legacy the way they want to. So once we have buyer and seller together, they've toured the practice, the buyer loves it, they want to write an LOI, which is a letter of intent. We also provide that template to the buyer. And then once that is accepted, we help manage the process from start to finish. And that is creating timelines and boundaries to keep the process moving. Because as you know, if there's no emails going, then the work is not being done. And you have to think about the buyer and the seller are still working all day long. And if they don't know they need to provide something, then it's not getting done. So it's really our job to keep the process moving. Next is we help work with their advisors. We've developed relationships with a lot of CPAs, attorneys, and the lenders. And if one of our clients doesn't have a relationship with a dental attorney, we're happy to facilitate those introductions. The next thing would basically be working with the buyer's lender. And oftentimes we get a long list. And like Greg said, we like to get a lot of information on the front end so that when the lender needs all that information, boom, it's just a quick email and we can just take care of that right away. So those are basically the next steps.
That's great. Thank you. Greg, can you tell me how lender underwriting has changed since the pandemic? What are you seeing that's different?
So yeah, I mean, the biggest thing obviously is they're asking more questions. And listen, I sat in that seat for a long time, so I'm not going to disparage the banks in any way. I don't know if any of the bank reps are watching this webinar, so hello, old friends. But listen, at the end of the day, we need the banks unless your buyer is going to pay cash, which isn't very, very rare that a buyer is going to, pay hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cash. So the banks, have the money. So we have to deal with them, and they're all working as fast as they can, and they're doing, as good a job as they can, but they're giving out large loans, and there's a process to that. And so there's the rep that the buyer is going to work with, but behind the scenes is the underwriter that's really the person making the decision on whether or not the loan is going to be approved. And I think what we've seen post-COVID, like I mentioned a minute ago, is they're just asking a lot more questions. They understand, I know I get this question a lot from my clients, from the seller, about 2020 and the numbers were down and how's that going to affect everything. The banks understand that your numbers were down in 2020. We all went through it. They know what happened. So they're not necessarily just focused on what your collection was or your gross revenue was in 2020. They're doing a lot of the things that we've touched on, here already on this webinar, in terms of looking at how the practice was performing before COVID and then how it bounced back since. They're just asking more questions in that underwriting process. So some things that they typically wouldn't have needed before, some of the banks need now. They might be looking for monthly production collection reports for a year or two. So you're talking about, 24, reports potentially, just so they can see how that practice is rebounded since, everything happened with COVID and the practice was reopened. I will tell you that what I've seen is most of the banks, especially the lenders that understand dental, the large lenders that understand these dental transactions and do this all the time, they're back to lending for the most part the way they were before, again, as long as that practice has bounced back. So I would say the biggest difference I've seen, to answer the question, is just asking more questions and needing more information, which is really just more on our plate, more work for us to do, and in consultation, of course, with our client, the seller. But I would tell you, I don't see anything where, it's certainly different than it was last, late summer of 2020 and into the fall, where some of them still had, some of their underwriting guidelines were much more strict coming out of COVID and trying to figure out what was going on. I don't see that as much anymore. It's really just a matter of asking more questions and maybe needing a little bit more information. But as long as the practice is bounced back for the most part and looks good, they're lending for the most part like they always have. It just might take a tad bit longer as the rush of people have come back to get loans. So they're dealing with that too, which frustrates us. And we're here to, yell at them, for lack of a better term, and tell them to move faster. But, that's probably the biggest thing, is maybe it's taken a tad bit longer, which I know seems crazy because you probably think it always took a long time. I remember those phone calls, but it's probably taken a little bit longer, and just asking a few more questions and needing some more information, but they're lending.
Yeah, and I'm seeing the same thing. I'm just seeing that it takes longer to get financing than it's taken in the past. And they are asking for a lot more information, which I certainly understand, but it does make that process a little bit longer. Jess, you want to add something?
I would also just say that let's just set the expectation that when you put a closing date on your LOI or your asset purchase agreement, it can be a little bit of a moving target. And the buyers and the sellers both need to be flexible and understand the lenders are doing the very best they can, and everybody is working as hard as they can to get this to the finish line. So I just always say, a close date, it can move a few days. So just be patient.
Yeah, and we're seeing a little bit of that as well. The other thing we're seeing more during 2020, but even a little bit into 2021, is sometimes the banks are asking the sellers to hold a little bit. hold a piece of the note for a couple of years. And then, once the buyer has proven themselves, they can refinance it into their main note. I've seen a little bit of that as well. Mhm. Sara, you want to finish the transition process for everybody?
Sure. So a dental transition is not a one size fits all model. Just like my colleagues have talked about, we deal with lenders and CPAs, and we provide guidance to the seller. And all this, though the seller is our client, and we represent the seller in the transaction, we are very involved with the buyer, making sure that they are keeping up with timelines and getting the advice that they need. So a lot of times our buyers may have a dental attorney. They may also have a dental accountant, but they don't really have somebody saying, hey, this credentialing with these insurance companies is an important component. And oh, by the way, when you credential with those insurance companies, here's what you need to say so that they don't send a letter or notice to that office. So we provide that, as Jessica was speaking, a lot of guidance along the way. We also provide a checklist to keep both parties on track. We provide exhibits. We help prepare the transition letter for the seller. We also coach our buyers and sellers on how to have a stellar team meeting, because they have to make the announcement to the staff, and that timeline has to be made. It's very important when they announce to their staff what's happening, because staff members will operate out of some fear if they cannot understand who the buyer is, and they're just going to be fearful about the process. So again, we really provide that consulting advice to help both parties have the successful transition that they need, because we at Henry Schein, we're different. We want to see those buyers successful. They buy products from us. We know that this sometimes is their first introduction into Henry Schein Dental, and we really want to support them being successful practitioners and carrying on the legacy for our sellers.
Thank you. Sometimes when I'm talking to sellers and explain how much buyer support we have, they ask me who I work for, and I explain I work for them, but supporting the buyer gets the transition process all the way to the end. The last thing you want to find out is you can't close because your buyer hasn't set up an entity, or your buyer hasn't done something that keeps you from closing. So supporting that buyer helps get that transition from point A to point B. So I love having happy sellers, but I also really like having happy buyers as well.
Absolutely. And those insurances can take quite a while to get. So, when we get the loan condition letter and those lenders are saying, hey, these are the insurances that need to be completed, we've got to talk to the buyer and say, hey, this policy is going to take you some time. Get started now. Right?
Yeah, and these are things like life insurance policies and disability policies that the banks are requiring that these borrowers have.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eileen.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for helping us with that. Tom, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Eileen. So I'm going to ask the three of you a couple questions about valuation differences. We talked about our standard valuation for a sale, but Greg, what other types of transitions do you support?
Well, one of the ones, unfortunately, that comes up from time to time is getting a call about a doctor who, may be sick or, unfortunately in a tragic situation may have passed away. And obviously it leaves their estate in a situation of now having this huge asset to sell. And if they weren't prepped for that, they didn't have the practice valuation done previously. We obviously spent some time already talking about the practice valuation. So one of the things that we will come across, and again, thankfully, of course, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen from time to time where we will see an emergency situation where we have to get in there, complete evaluation, or just even get the practice on the market while we're completing evaluation quickly, because of course, the longer that there's not a producing doctor in the practice, the value of that practice is going to start coming down as those patients need somewhere to go. So one of the things that we will definitely see and have a lot of experience with on our end is that emergency planning when something like that happens, and we're in there helping the estate, helping the family get that practice on the market and selling it and getting as much value as we can in a situation where we have to turn it around really quickly.
Thanks, Greg. Jessica, what's another transition that valuations can support?
So, a very hot topic and very popular option is adding an associate. It is a challenge, though. I partner quite a bit with Nationwide Dental Opportunities and Cindy Bickers. They do a really fantastic job of having their buyer candidates all over the country, and then we refer our sellers to them, and they can either recruit an associate, and there's many options with that as well. So there's two different types of associates. There's those who just want to work and earn a W-2. Then there's the other type who want to eventually buy into the practice. This poses a very large challenge for a lot of sellers because their practice has to have enough production to support 2 doctors, and there has to be enough space. So when I get those calls, I often suggest, okay, we need to start with evaluations, see where the numbers are, see where the cash flow is, see what your plan is. Are you planning on backing down from 4 days a week to 2 so that the associate has enough production where they can survive? So it's definitely a lot, but it's a good option. It just doesn't work for everybody.
Thanks, Jessica. And Sara, talk about another one that we're seeing a growing number of transactions.
Well, I don't know that I'm going to do it justice, Dr. Snyder. You are the partnership guru, but we are definitely seeing a lot more partnerships. And I know most of you have probably attended one of Dr. Snyder's webinars. But I think what's really important to note about partnerships is it has to be set up for success. And I think of a partnership as a marriage. It really is important that there's clinical expectations and financial expectations and projections, and what are the operating agreements going to be like, and all of that. And although we don't provide legal advice, Dr. Snyder does provide the partnership consulting that we need so that the doctors can get the deal to the table. And I'm just thinking about a current partnership that, a broker just put these 2 gentlemen together and said, you're going to be partners. And I was asked to, in my previous role with consulting, I was asked to come in and fix the problem because there was no consulting guidance given. So I had to go in and I met with both doctors separately, and the partner that had just bought into the practice, he had no patients. There were no allocation of patients. There was no, how are new patients going to be distributed? And this poor guy who had just spent $900,000 to buy into this partnership was eager and wanted to do his part. But again, there wasn't a plan. So if you're going to learn anything about me during this webinar, it is that having a plan is an important aspect of a transition. And there's so much to partnerships, and it does really require a level of expertise in the consulting field to get the deal put together, because in that one that I'm mentioning, the only people that are getting paid on that were the attorneys battling it out. And Dr. Snyder takes that out of the mix so that we get to the finish line and a win-win.
Well, thanks, Sara. But I can tell you, with all the partnerships I've done, there's no 2 partnerships that are alike. So I'll be speaking about this topic in the fall. So those of you who are interested, you'll be hearing about that. We're doing a webinar on that topic. So let's switch gears for a minute now. A lot of discussion back, in the early part of 2020 when COVID really was locking everything down. Everybody said, oh, woe is me. What's my practice going to be worth? Will practices be worth anything in 2021 what they were in 2019? So I'd like to ask each of you, in your particular markets, are you finding that practices are holding their value in your market? Jessica, I'll go for you first.
So I cover Oregon and Washington, and I would definitely say that practices are still holding their value. There's two types of practices. There are the ones that were struggling pre-COVID, and those ones are largely still struggling. And then there's the rock star practices that, had the mandatory shutdown, but then just picked right back up and have gone gangbusters. And oftentimes, most of them have done even better. So the values are holding steady, and the Pacific Northwest is still a very desirable place. So we're looking good over here.
Great. Thanks. Sarah.
Well,
how about you?
Yeah, sure. I would say that Michigan is definitely holding its market. We have a lot of people that want to be business owners. And although some buyers have come off the market because they have found practices that were listed, we are still really busy here. Things are doing well. And I think Michigan is a nice place to be too. I know we've got some weather issues. It's probably not quite like the Pacific Northwest, but we have beautiful summers here. So come to Michigan.
Oh. Greg, how about New England?
The market's terrible. Nobody wants to buy or sell. No. Yeah, I think just like my colleague said, New England's always a good market. To be honest, it's a place where people want to be. There's a lot of buyers because of the dental schools. So it's just a good mix of buyers and sellers in New England. And just like, the housing market here, the dental practice market is no different. I see practices, and Jess kind of touched on this before. Of course, if the practices bounce back, there's no shortage of buyers looking at that practice. I always use the adage, and I think everybody on this call has heard me say this before, but and I'll get the question: is it from a seller or buyer? Is it a seller's market or is it a buyer's market? I understand the question and I understand the theory behind it, but I'm not a big fan of it because, listen, if you have a good practice, it's a seller's market. If you have a practice that nobody wants to buy, it's not really a seller's market. So I would say in New England, the practices that have bounced back are, having no shortage of buyers look at those practices and they're still getting full value or close to full value. Some of that also depends on the timeline, right, of my seller. If I have a seller that needs to be out or just wants to be out immediately, they might be willing to take a little bit less. But if I have a seller that is, prepared to go a few months to find that right fit, they're getting, full value for the practice, and we're getting somebody in there that's a good fit. So yeah, I think where we are now as we head into the summer of 2021, things have been very, very busy, and there's no shortage of transactions that we're seeing, and practices that are good practices that have bounced back definitely have buyers for them.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Okay, Eileen, turn it over to you.
Okay. I guess the question is related to prospective purchasers, and we've covered it a little bit, but are you finding they're hesitant to buy practice pre-COVID? Are they asking for more information? Are they taking longer? Is there a difference you're seeing, pre-COVID to now? Let's see. Jess, can you start?
Dentists are funny. Sometimes, the information provided creates paralysis by analysis. So those dentists are still going to be the same way. But for the most part, I'm not seeing hesitancy on a buyer's side. Like Greg said, if it's a strong practice and if it's desirable, they're going to jump on it. The only hesitancy is going to come from the banks, and that's just because they want more and more information. So buyers are still out there, they're still purchasing, banks are still lending. It's just taking a little more information and a little bit more time.
Great, thank you. Greg?
The question specifically is because of COVID. Am I noticing?
Yeah, I mean, are you, so for example, I had buyers who backed out during COVID. They were, had letter of intent, they were ready to buy practices, and they said, I'm not doing this.
Right.
And I saw some hesitancy through September, October. And I think for the most part, that hesitancy, certainly in my market, has gone away. Are you seeing that in your market?
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that at this point, there's no hesitancy because of COVID issues. I think we've gotten past that. And I know we've mentioned this now a couple of times in the past few minutes, but as long as the practice has shown that it's bounced back.
Right.
But I think to Jess's point, you still have some certainly paralysis, by analysis with some of the first-time buyers mainly that just haven't bought it before, and that overwhelming feeling of doing this for the first time. That still happens, but that was happening before COVID. So I think in terms of COVID, we definitely saw that. I agree, same thing back late summer of last year and into the fall. Everybody was kind of pressing pause a little bit to see where this thing went. But at this particular point, no, I don't see buyers hesitant because of COVID as long as the practices come back.
Sounds great. The one thing that I will add to what you all have been saying is I still am seeing a huge difference between my metropolitan markets and my rural markets. The rural practices continue to take a lot longer to sell just because they have smaller buyer pools. There are just less people willing to go to those areas. And so I am still continuing to see that in my market.
Well, and if I can jump in on that, sorry. So Oregon and Washington, there's, the I-5 corridor, but then there's a lot of rural areas that are becoming very popular. So when I talk to students at OHSU in Portland, I always say, don't discount the rural practices. Yeah, you may not be very close to, the sporting events or the theaters or, the things that are in the urban settings, but you can make oftentimes very profitable incomes in the rural markets. So I never say discount those. I always say look at them. So
yeah, I find that most of my rural practices are incredibly profitable.
Yes.
They have low rent, they have low staff costs, and a lot of them, basically own that patient market because the doctors have either moved out or closed. And so those practices are doing really, really well. Sounds good. Tom, we'll turn it over to you.
Hey, this generation of dentists, are a lot different than my generation. Back in the day, you went to a community, you practiced, and then you retired. But that's not for the last 15, 20 years. We've seen a lot of dentists do multiple transitions. So we find that this is a common occurrence. So how can we assist these doctors who are looking for new opportunities? Jessica, I think you have some good ideas.
Yeah, I would say that about 50% of my transitions right now are doctors who are either consolidating and selling their second practice, or they're looking to relocate to another state for, personal reasons. So we have a super unique team where we represent almost every state in the country, and we're extremely interconnected. So if I have somebody who's interested in moving to the East Coast, I might call Greg, I might call Sarah, but I oftentimes work very closely with Blaine Brown. He's in Idaho. So when I get a new listing, I reach out to the teammates who are closest to me and say, hey, I have this great practice. Do you have anybody in your pipeline who would be looking for this? And it's vice versa. So we work and operate as a team nationally, which is super unique. I oftentimes feel like I'm on an island because I cover 2 states, but we talk and we do weekly webinars and seminars, so we get to see each other, and it's just a great opportunity to be a part of this team.
Thank you. How about you, Sarah?
Well, I would just like to add, as we have, Jessica, Greg, and myself, the 3 of us come from very different backgrounds. Real estate, lending, practice consulting. And that is another thing that really makes our team unique. Because if I have a lending question, not that I haven't dealt with lenders, but if I have a lending question, I could call Greg and say, Greg, hey, you were in this business. How do we solve this? And we collaborate and help each other through the process. Same thing with, real estate. And again, I think I've helped 1 or 2 of my colleagues out with some consulting and insurance questions and how to do that. So, anyway, I work with, I have a colleague here in Michigan as well that I work with, Denise Boheis. I also want to say that we, I had a doctor I just reached out to that said, hey, I'm no longer looking in Michigan. I'm going to be moving. And so I'm able to reach out to my team across the US and say, hey, great buyer, no longer looking to be a Michigan dentist. Do you have anything that could be a fit? And then I communicated with the buyer and said, hey, just so you know, I've informed my colleague, you do not need to sign another confidentiality agreement. We're going to share that. We'll take that step out of the process. So go find your practice that's going to become your home. So they really appreciate the communication.
Super. Well, thank you all for a lot of the insights that you gave our audience tonight. So in closing, what's one thing you would like our audience to know? Greg, I'll ask you first.
So yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot I could say, but I think to keep it simple, I would say be prepared. We talked about getting a practice valuation and getting it done, hopefully, maybe a couple of years out from when you're actually thinking you want to sell your practice. So be prepared. And the biggest thing, and I know this sounds very, I guess, obvious, but work with people that know what they're doing. From ourselves, of course, even if it's not us. I mean, we want it to be us and it should be us, but work with somebody that does this for a living and can help you do these things, because there's a lot that goes into it. It's not like selling your house, which is we hear that a lot, is the comparison. It's a business. It's a living, breathing thing. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot that goes into this.
Okay. Sara, your turn.
Well, Greg kind of touched on the whole planning thing, which you probably know by now, but I guess what I want you to take away from this, I know we gave a lot of information. It's not a one size fits all. Your transition is unique. It is based on your goals. It is based on your practice and what you want. So legacy matters, and it matters to your patients. It matters to your team, and it matters to us. So I want you to feel comfortable and confident. I want to leave you with, we are always here as a resource to schedule a call, to talk to you about your practice. And the call is between your transition consultant and you. And we're here to help. So thank you so very much for your time tonight.
Jessica.
Well, Greg and Sara did a fantastic job of summing it all up. I would say the golden nugget that I have is that not only to have a valuation in place, but a letter of instruction. That is the most important tool. Every single person on this call should request one. It is completely free, and it basically has all of your business information in one place. It goes in your safe in case there's an emergency and you can no longer practice, or there's a disability or an accident or something. That is something I give to every single doctor who does evaluation. That's my golden nugget. And then the second thing is, it's the power of our team. So when you have us work for you, help you with your transition, you not only get me, but you get access to everybody on my team. And that is Dr. Tom Snyder. That is Eileen. That is everybody else. And we are here to help support you. If I don't know the answer, I will find the right person who will know the answer. And so I take a lot of pride in being a part of this team.
Jessica, and thank you all for your insights tonight. And just so you know, you only heard from 3 people, but there's 60 plus other transition sales consultants across the country who are all equally qualified and ready, willing, and able to assist you, whether it's your long-term or short-term transition plans. And if you'd like to reach out to one of our local transition consultants in your area, I'm going to give you an email address, and you can just jot an email down and we'll have someone contact you. That email address is ppt@henryschein.com. And we also have our website where you can learn a lot about what we do. And that is hsppt.com. So again, I want to thank you all tonight for joining us, and hope that you really had some good takeaways from this evening. Wish you all a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tom, and everyone, for a stellar webinar. As a thank you for attending, all attendees will receive the recording of this webinar via email sometime in the next week, so keep your eyes out for that. For more Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you back here soon. Have a great night.